25 minutes to 2 o'clock. As you know, very well know, the issues around our education and the phased reopening of schools is far from being completely resolved. And schools in South Africa have been closed for 10 weeks. And we've been caught up in just a bungle around the reopening, which has caused a lot of anxiety. There's been a lot of confusion as well to parents, to the children, as well as the teachers. And one would have thought that it was enough time, that the department had enough time to get itself organized, to formulate a solid plan. And this has been really to the detriment of parents and teachers. And so today we're looking at how we can ensure that our education system doesn't leave any learners behind during the lockdown. Because one of the biggest concerns about the lockdown and COVID-19 is the growing inequality in education. The pandemic has exposed education and underlying conditions. They were always there. They were there. The education system's own underlying conditions. They were there before COVID-19. And all it's done is that it's shone a spotlight on them. The lack of toilets, water, classrooms, textbooks, the high student to teacher ratio that undermines the education of our children and the well-being of our teachers. And there's also a less visible way in which schools play an important role. They are, to an extent, a sort of equalizer, or they sort of try to minimize that gap between offering meals and providing space for learning. Schools help to address some, not all, of the inequalities that students face at home. And so now that everyone is learning from home, the role that those inequalities play in education are absolutely on full display. And then students, not to mention teachers, can lack technology and connectivity to be able to learn or to be able to teach online. Or they can also face challenges within the home circumstances that make it hard for them to be focused on their education during what is that allotted school learning, that school time. So solutions have been far from optimal. The things that we're seeing are far from optimal, and the department continues to try and have a successful phased reopening of school. And so joining us for this conversation is Kristal Duncan-Williams. She's a project lead for Youth Capital, and it's a project which is incubated by the DG Murray Trust. And what they do is that they look at data and they match that with the lived experiences of young people. Thank you so much for joining us, Kristal. Hello.
Good afternoon, Azania. Thanks for having me.
Yes, nice that you could be with us. We're confronted with many issues in our education system, and really COVID-19 has just made them even more glaring. We can't hide, we can't ignore, and we are seeing where the neglect has been all this time. But how has COVID-19 magnified the problems of our education system?
Well, at Youth Capital, we're a youth-led campaign with an action plan for change. As you said, we combine research with young people's lived experiences to really change the story on youth unemployment. And we believe education is obviously a key point when it comes to shifting the stark realities of youth unemployment in this country. And the issues that we're seeing coming forward in the education system have existed for probably close on 2 decades, if we're honest with ourselves. The inequalities in the education system. So you hear from, quintile 5 or former model C schools, depending on how you refer to them. Those kids have been learning throughout lockdown. They have access to internet. They have access to devices. Their teachers have access to the internet and devices. The school itself has a program that the teachers are following, and those learners have continued to learn throughout lockdown. This is in stark contrast to the majority of learners in South Africa who, I know teachers have been trying. Teachers have gotten some flack over this time. And I think it's a bit unfair because a lot of teachers have been trying using WhatsApp, or I've heard about teachers photocopying and dropping off notes for kids at their doors. I mean,
I've heard about teachers using that, the feeding program as a way of also sharing that learning material. You know, when kids come to school, not to get their meal, they have a quick exchange of the learning material or notes.
Exactly. But we're dealing with the system that is broken. I mean, I hear about stories of kids in more rural areas having to kind of know when the teacher's going to WhatsApp, and then one kid takes the phone and runs onto a hill somewhere where there's signal, because even if you got given data, your network coverage is poor. Which we've experienced with our youth network. We had workshops we were going to run face-to-face, which we've now taken online, and obviously providing our youth with data to take part, but some of them, just despite their best efforts, cannot join online discussions because their network coverage is bad. So all of these kind of systematic failures have just been highlighted by COVID-19. The fact that I think the original DBE report, when they started talking about schools going back, cited a number in the region of 3,500 schools which don't have running water. This is unacceptable, and that existed long before COVID-19. And the department's inability to address those challenges before means that now they're scrambling to react in a crisis which none of us were prepared for, really.
And even when kids are able to connect, and able to have that limited access to teachers and so on, is there effective teaching even taking place, or effective learning, I should say, taking place? Because I spoke to a 10-year-old over the weekend who said that he was pulling out his hair. And when we asked, why are you pulling out your hair? He says, I just get so frustrated because it's hard to understand some of these concepts on my own. And we have limited time with each teacher. And he expressed the challenge so well that it is clear that this way of learning is something that not all kids are able to adapt to.
Absolutely. And I think, again, one of our calls to action at Youth Capital is that we need a catch-up strategy for learners and any students, even if you're speaking about post-school study opportunities. And what we mean by that is a lot of young people are not on track for their grade or their level of study wherever they are. They lack foundational skills in literacy and numeracy for whatever reason, whether it's overcrowded classrooms, whether they have learning barriers that haven't been diagnosed. They've just missed some basics along the way. And they get pushed along in the system until eventually those kids give up and drop out. We know that we have high dropout rates in this country, despite the data being a bit difficult to get hold of or to pinpoint exactly. We know that that's happening. And so this lockdown situation, if you were at risk of dropping out or you weren't understanding the material when you were in the classroom, there's very, very, very little chance that you are understanding that material now. And this is why a catch-up strategy for those learners was so important before COVID-19, and is even more important now. And this really gives the education department an opportunity to say, we acknowledge that there are learning gaps. Here's a plan for addressing those gaps, instead of trying to move ahead when you're actually leaving half of the learners behind.
Yes. And with all the breakdowns in communication from the DBE, it's clear that learners are not equipped to learn equally. And the risk is that we will leave some learners behind, which really is a travesty. It's an injustice, in fact, and something that must be avoided at all costs. Because as you say, already it's hard to retain learners in the schooling system. I think it was the minister as well in one of her briefings, or her deputy, in fact, when they noted that the longer that learners are out of school for, the harder it is for them to return. And so the catch-up strategy that you speak of, ways of continuing to engage learners, needs to be maintained right through. So is that to be when schools resume, or should it be something that is already happening while they are at home?
Well, to be honest with you, it's something that should have been in place, as I say, long before COVID-19 hit. Learners that are behind should, in a perfect world, would be identified, would get extra support, whether it's after hours or, meetings between parents and teachers where parents are equipped to do some work with their kids at home to help them catch up. Whether it's reading more at home or, doing extra maths, whatever it might be. If those plans were in place before, and those learners, if there was an accurate way to identify and track those learners, then teachers even now would have known that learner A, B, and C, they've probably been learning fine, but learner D, E, and F was struggling before, they should get some extra attention. And so we're saying we should have had this plan. We didn't have this plan. And now learners are going to come back, and teachers are not actually going to necessarily know who needs what extra support. Bearing in mind that learners and teachers are coming back with a load of anxiety, with lots of kind of mental stress with dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah.
Whatever might have been happening, as you said at the beginning, school is actually a safe haven for a lot of learners. There's issues of violence, there's issues of food security in their homes, and coming to school, you get a meal, you get a safe space to be for a couple of hours, and so learners might be desperate to come back to school, regardless of the anxieties we all might feel around that, and schools do need to reopen at some point. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge the mental toll that it's taken on learners, and how are teachers equipped to deal with that going forward is another question.
I really would love to hear from teachers as part of this conversation, and parents and guardians. We had teachers responding to our previous conversation in the half hour. If you're still with us, then do give us a call as you have these exchanges with your learners. What is your experience? Are you finding that there are learners who are being left behind systematically, slowly, that this is happening, that some are struggling to learn in this way, this distant way that we are seeing, which is a consequence of the lockdown, of course? Give us a call on 011-883-0702. Your observations and insights, of course, around how your children are learning as you interact with them, and just some of the challenges in interacting with them. We heard there's an example of a lack of data, for instance, a lack of technology to enable your interaction with children. That's 011-883-0702. So, Kristal, are there things that we can start to also think about, like much needed action we should take at policy level now to ensure that all learners are going to be equipped to learn equally?
Absolutely. So at a policy level, what Youth Capital has been calling for is, as usual with many policies in this country, we actually have policies in place. We have policies in place for, having individual learner plans, for having systems to address learners, to identify learners who are having problems, to give them extra support. But in reality, because of under-resourced HR constraints, a lot of that doesn't happen, or it takes a really long time for it to happen. And so we're saying that, again, the policy should speak to the realities on the ground. And the implementation of the policy is what we need. So we have the repetition policy, which essentially means that learners can only fail once per phase and then get progressed. And we also have the policy that speaks to learning barriers and educational assessment of learners. But in reality, those policies are often not carried out equally. Again, a resource school can follow those guidelines quite easily, but your under-resourced school will struggle. Teachers are already, dealing with 50 kids in a class. They don't have a dedicated counselor or somebody to deal with those issues. And so what happens is that the learners suffer in the end. And so our call is really around implementing those policies. And then, for anybody out there, we've a lot of the time these conversations can feel like it's all on the government and it's all on the education department to solve everything. And yes, they have to play their part. But in our youth network, we've really seen young people step up to the plate during this time of crisis and lockdown. And we've had lots of young people who have started offering tutoring via WhatsApp. So students who are in tertiary education offering high school students tutoring over WhatsApp via specific subjects, whatever they are comfortable in. And some of our Youth Capital influencers have actually partnered with Ikamva Youth to get that going. So we can all play our small part in something that is quite a big challenge. But I guess we all have to, do what we can if we want things to change.
Let's take this call from Chantal in Roodepoort. Hi, Chantal. Thank you for the call.
Thank you so much for having me.
What's been your experience with your child learning from home? Some of the challenges you've seen?
The challenges is they're overloaded with work, and there's stuff that they don't understand. The teachers are not there to give them the proper guidelines. It has come to that point where my child has just decided, what stuff is. I ain't going back to school. The psychological and emotional impact all of this has got on the children. The government hasn't ever thought of that. Yes, we need to get them back to school. Yes, there is some with underlying illnesses, such as my own daughter. But the fact remains they're not coping with the work. and the workload that's being sent out via WhatsApp and via messages and via Zoom classes.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Chantal, thank you for sharing that. Kristal, this touches on psychosocial support, that we need to somehow recognize the importance of psychosocial support in the education journey of our learners. What role does it play? And if you could speak to what Chantal has just expressed.
Absolutely. So another one of our calls to action is hashtag support us. And we're saying that young people need support beyond the classroom. So a lot of what I've spoken around our corporate catch-up strategy or hashtag catch us up is around academic support. But as your caller Chantal and you have just highlighted, support for young people goes far beyond that. It's the emotional support, it's the mental support, in some cases financial support, the food security. Learners need all of those things to be in place to thrive in the educational journey. And we've seen when it comes to dropout that, having a caring adult, having somebody who actually cares about you and follows up with you, sees how you're doing, can make a huge difference to a young person and actually reduces their risk of dropping out of school. The sad reality is that most schools don't have a qualified counselor on board or a life orientation teacher. We might have life orientation in the curriculum, but it's often seen as an unimportant subject. Teachers who are not qualified to really give guidance and counseling are often given the syllabus to teach because it doesn't really count for anything. It's not an important subject. And I think we need to shift that perception at school. Every single group of young people I've spoken to in the last 2 years, and that's numbering over 500 in person across the country, that's not even talking about social media, every single young person will say they need mental health support. And so like Chantal is saying, it's a weight that young people feel, and they often feel that adults do not acknowledge it or see it, and they don't have a space to talk about it. And so if something good, in inverted commas, could come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's maybe to create the space for mental debriefings and for young children to actually express their concerns and how this has affected them. Because it's not just about feeling like you don't know the work, it's the isolation, right? Young people need to be with other young people, and they, even the really young kids are missing the interaction with friends and that social interaction. And what effect has this had on young people? We don't actually know.
Yes. Oh, and we can all play a part. Earlier on, you mentioned the fact that this is something that all role players. I was just thinking about even the psychosocial support for teachers, but as a broader school community, what can we do? As you say, you have a call to action, but this is, as you said, not just the department or the government's responsibility. It's the entire school community that can play a part.
Absolutely.
It's almost, because in my mind, it's almost as if families are isolated. Families with their children are isolated, connecting via this network of technology. And maybe there isn't enough cross conversations going on amongst parents, amongst families, with schools. Yes, the authorities can't get involved necessarily at that level, but just within the school community itself, the school, the children, and the parents.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we must also acknowledge, I know Chantal spoke about the burden on a child, but I'm sure her as a parent and many other parents feel ill-equipped to help their child. If your child's doing high school mathematics and you haven't done maths for 10 or 20 years, it's unlikely you'd be able to help them. And I think most parents would be in that boat. So I think parents are also feeling that they want to help their children, but they're unable to do that. And so I think to really, like you say, lean into support networks. If you are a parent who feels you have a skill to offer, whether that skill is, I actually understand high school maths, or that skill is, I've got some kind of counseling qualification. People have lay counselor qualifications that maybe phone up the school and say, I'm happy to give some counseling to some kids, or I'm happy to give some math tutoring to some kids. I think that social capital in South Africa is vastly underutilized. It's why we call youth capital. We believe that young people are really the capital of this country, and so I think if you're talking about things that, everybody can get involved in, then, getting onto that WhatsApp group and offering your skill, whatever it might be, is one step. And your skill might actually be, I'm also just a concerned parent, and let's just talk to each other about it and be honest about our fears and our anxieties. Yeah.
I agree with you. Let's go to Kathleen calling us from Johannesburg, Kristal. Hi, Kathleen.
Hi, ma'am. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you, Kathleen. You can go ahead.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes, hello.
Hello. How are you, ma'am?
Hi. I'm good. You can go ahead. Tell us what you're thinking.
I'm speaking to Kathleen.
Yeah?
Yeah, and I'm in the education field currently. And I just wanted, thank you for the guest and the topic that you're having. It's quite informative, and I think a lot of people need to hear such things, because of one thing that the COVID has shown me, COVID-19 pandemic, is inequalities. I mean, when we also speak about inclusive education in some of our township schools and rural schools, you don't find the conversation or the much desired focus on issues of inclusive education. So, yeah, it's just to highlight, bring forth the matters of education, that there's so much inequality and to some extent injustices, because even what the minister what took place, that there was a premature pronouncement, and then later on they had to come back because, the fortunate reality is not every school is ready to open when you look at the guidelines that are put in place.
So you're unhappy from that perspective, but what about from the learning that's had to go on during this period? As you say, there are inequalities. There are inequalities in our school system. So what have you? What have been these differences? The areas of struggle that you have seen as far as trying to teach is concerned.
Again, issues of inequality will bring about accessibility issues. So you'd find that the only content that learners can access is basically what is aired on TV and on radios. But you find that in other schools, because of inequality, they are more equal than others, or maybe more privileged than others. Then there are those sites, those platforms, those social media, like there is activity educational-wise, so that the learner can continue to learn. So that's so much of a gap. I mean, coming back to teach our learners next week, we're still going to have a mountain to climb, because to re-socialize them into a learning experience once again, it's a challenge. And, that is brought forth by our inequality in education.
And how significant is losing a term, Kathleen? Because the minister did say that we've lost an entire term. The second term is lost.
Of course. I mean, look at the amount of time that learners have spent outside of class. And I mean, most of them, I'm looking at a township situation where you'd find that most of them are just wandering about, doing whatever that they're doing. So it's going to be a challenge for us as teachers to just bring them back to a space where they are able to know that now we're supposed to learn. And, it's a challenge, but I think with the education system post-COVID-19, there needs to be a re-looking at how we can balance it off to make it equal, so that learning can still take place in the pandemic,
Absolutely. And removing the impediments to learning in our schools. Kathleen, thank you very much for your time. Kristal, thank you for sharing those insights from the work that you're doing at Youth Capital. Our listeners can, of course, follow the research that you do by going to Youth Capital SA. That's one of the easier ways of doing so on social media. Thank you, Kristal.
Thanks so much, Azania.
That was Kristal Duncan-Williams, and she's a project lead for Youth Capital. And they pretty much look at data and look at the lived experiences of young people in, of course, drawing these insights and in formulating approaches that society can take regarding various issues confronting young people.